Hello and welcome back to Scouching. Today we are looking at a player that everyone has known about for quite a few years now in the Winnipeg Ice forward, Matthew Savoie. By my count, Matthew Savoie has been on radars for what feels like about 5 years. He had a tremendous pre-WHL campaign, attempted to get exceptional player status and was denied, but still went on to play over 20 games in the WHL as a 15-year-old. During the pandemic, he played part of the season with the Dubuque Fighting Saints in the USHL and was over a point per game. And all of that just fanned the hype flames going into this season where Savoie would play his first full year with the Winnipeg Ice of the WHL. And to some, he didn't disappoint. He finished 7th in WHL scoring with 90 points, and playing on a team that finished top of the table is yet another accolade to add to Savoie's pre-draft resume, which is already pretty impressive. And as such, he's been very, very hotly discussed going into the 2022 draft. But from my point of view as a part of the scouting community out there, he's been hotly debated for a number of different reasons. Yes, the production and the resume are really, really impressive to this point, but there are some in hockey circles that remain skeptical about Matthew Savoie a little bit. Specifically about his style of play, what he'll be able to get away with at the National Hockey League level, and honestly, my track data kind of backs it up a little. So to start, Savoie's possession data, as you would expect for a player that was at the top of their conference this year, is really good. He had a dangerous shot attempt percentage of 67%, which is basically dominating, and he finished with an offensive threat metric of over 26, which puts him 16th in my dataset. This was largely driven by his rate of dangerous passes, which was 13th in my dataset for forwards, and 22.3% of his pass attempts were directed to or through the slot, which puts him 12th in my dataset there as well. Beyond that, Savoie's rate of dangerous shot attempts against put him 17th in my dataset, and when you combine shot assists and shot attempts that he took, he sat 20th in terms of shot attempt creation for his team while he's on the ice. But that is literally the last data points that put him in the top 20 among forwards I tracked this year. What about dangerous shooting? With 5.6 dangerous shot attempts from high danger and 9.1 dangerous shot attempts in total, Savoie sits further back than 30th in my dataset. Shot assists, he sits just shy of 12 per 60 minutes at 5-on-5, which is good enough for 21st amongst forwards in my dataset. And his transition data, to me, especially offensively, is, for a player of his caliber, I think legitimately concerning. While 69% and 43% respectively for offensive and defensive controlled zone transition percentages are certainly more than acceptable, Savoie sat 59th out of 80 tracked forwards in terms of total offensive transitions where he's involved. And if you look at the percentage of offensive transitions for his team where Savoie is involved, he drops to 67th out of 80 with a number under 25%. And we just profiled a defenseman who was up near 30% playing against pro competition in Europe. And furthermore, when you look at the percentage of all of his offensive transitions that were completed carries, he sat 50th of 80, which, considering what you might have heard or read about his style of play, might surprise you. In fact, in terms of his offensive transition involvement, there are 9 defenders that I have tracked that are more involved in offensive transitions than Savoie has been. But what kind of fascinated me about Matthew Savoie that I did not expect is that he is significantly more involved in defensive transitions than you would expect. He sits 23rd in terms of defensive zone transition involvement at just over 12%. And while his rate of allowing those transitions with control was a little high, approaching 50%, I at least feel a little more comfortable knowing that this is a player that tries to pester opponents on defensive transitions, and he does get involved more than you might think. And for a potential play-driving center like Savoie, I'd rather that be the case than the opposite, where he's not particularly involved and maybe efficient when he is involved, but just is not really there a whole lot. So on the whole, the indicators here show that this is a player that is a very, very strong offensive contributor, especially through playmaking through the middle of the ice with an improving rate of shot attempts coming from dangerous space game by game. But that's basically it when it comes to high-end output at 5-on-5, especially offensively. But Savoie remains in my top 10, so let's start looking at some video and figure out why that might be. So when reviewing my archive of Matthew Savoie footage from this year, a couple of things really stuck out to me. The first is the quickness of his hands and feet to change angles of attack and offensive rushes, and the second, in my view, is really underrated, and that's his ability to fend off and fight against pressure from forecheckers in the offensive zone, using his body and hands to keep defenders at bay, keep the puck away from errant sticks, and extending possession in ways that prolong offensive cycles. He shows a really good ability to get the jump on some slower defenders, gaining some valuable space in his first couple of steps, and sometimes that's more than enough to win races to loose pucks. And I also absolutely believe the kind of playmaking data that I was seeing out of Matthew Savoie and how it can project to the National Hockey League. He loved to use pace and momentum to drive deep into the offensive zone, drawing pressure away from the flow of his route a lot and moving pucks into that open space in front of the net to create dangerous chances. And Savoie just seems to have great small area spatial awareness of his line mates. He knows where they are. He knows where they're headed. He knows where to put the puck so that they can retrieve it. And these little tiny one-touch passes that he can make here and there changes angles on goaltenders, and it's pretty much statistically proven at this point that pre-shot passing can be a pretty major factor in terms of what might be able to score against NHL goaltenders. Even in full stride, chasing down offensive loose pucks, he showed very little hesitation when he knew where to put pucks. He showed little hesitation to execute on his passing options, and again, this reinforced and indicated strong line-mate awareness and good playmaking ability at 5-on-5. And as alluded to before in the video, in my sample, Savoie's offensive generation kind of transformed over the course of the year. In my first few games I tracked, he was far more pass-focused in the offensive zone, but in the last 4 games I tracked, he was far more shot-focused in terms of generating offense. His rate of individual dangerous shot attempts went from 1.62 in the first couple of games tracked to 14.8 in the last 4, and his dangerous pass rates did drop a little bit from 19.5 to 16.5, but also that might be a little bit of noise there, so we'll call it about even. But in games 6 and 7, he managed just 2 total dangerous pass attempts while having those strong rates of dangerous shot attempts. But honestly, to me, this was a bit of a welcome shift in Savoie's game, being able to use his feet and hands and quickness to get into the middle of the ice and really challenge those scoring areas himself. So in a sense, he kind of went from one-dimensional playmaker style of play to a weird hybrid, inconsistent mix of both offensive passing work and shot work. But this does allow him to be a bit of a dual-threat offensive player if things go right and he finds a little more consistency, baiting goaltenders into thinking he's shooting only to send cross-crease passes for easy tap-ins. And while Savoie did show signs of a quick shooter's release on the rush, he did show an ability to float around open space in the offensive zone, finding those scoring areas where he generated chances for himself time and time again, especially later on in the year. He's just a player where if you look at his size, I can absolutely forgive you for thinking he might be a little bit softer or too lean focused in the offensive direction, but this is a player that I found was really impressive, moving pucks around to line mates in the offensive zone, fending off pressure, and combining all of these things in conjunction to be a good offensive contributor. As alluded to in the data, Savoie can use his quickness and intensity to chase down puck carriers on defensive rushes, and he can at least involve himself and try to force opponents into decision-making in situations they don't want to be in. And with that speed and quickness on his edges, if there were a turnover, Savoie can quickly get play turned around and start quarterbacking rushes going the other way. But again, as indicated in the offensive data, he wasn't doing this a whole lot, but at least he's capable of it. He may be small, sure, but if he keeps his feet moving, he is certainly tenacious and aggressive and tries to make things happen defensively. As he gets older and stronger, I imagine that he should continue to be able to push rushes wide, closer to along the boards and outside of dangerous space, and I think there is decent potential here for Savoie as a defensively competent forward, whether it's at center or the wing. He also showed that quick thinking when it came to winning races to pucks, lifting sticks really quickly and effectively at just the right moment to fetch pucks first, or he could give line mates valuable time to get to those loose pucks before another opponent does. But this is where the issues with Savoie start to show up. For all the tenacity and aggression that I saw out of Savoie most of the time, there was a bit of an inconsistency here, as he was a little bit unable to constantly generate turnovers and get the physical upper hand on opponents. For all the agility and stick skill I caught, there were times where I felt that he was just far too inactive, standing still, being a stationary target for opponents to just blow right through. And he does have a bit of a lack of reach and strength, and this did lead to a somewhat high level of defensive controlled zone transition percentages. So if Savoie can nail down that quickness a little bit more and get going a little bit quicker and get a little bit stronger, closing those gaps a little bit quicker, getting those stick checks to be a little more consistent, and closing gaps a little more effectively, I think means that his defensive signs are bright for a player to be at least competent defensively in the NHL. Because once the puck does start coming the other way, Savoie can make simple little first pass breakouts even if he doesn't lack truly elite level speed, where he can sort of get those breakouts going himself through those passes. But again, it just didn't happen as much as you think for a player that has this kind of a reputation and this kind of point production. At least it didn't happen that often at 5-on-5, which is where most hockey is played. So the big question might be then, why is such an offensively skilled player being labeled with these concerns if they have skill, and they have agility, and they have defensive intensity? And in my view, it's about two different things. One is projecting that resilience against bigger and stronger competition in the NHL. It's hard to predict without seeing him in the NHL, and I lean towards thinking that at least the instincts are there and strength improvements should help. But more concerningly, I felt that Savoie really struggled to have a separation gear from players in transition. He just felt too easy to counter if I were coaching against him, because he has a bit of a hard time getting away from defenders as opposed to just continuously fighting them off. And that lack of separation gear might have also given him a bit of a panic complex when pucks hit his stick, as I found a few occasions where he would have plenty of time and space to make a read and analyze options, but would jump to low percentage passes or dumping pucks out of the defensive end that caused a few needless turnovers. Being able to recognize when he can be patient or when he can make reads and make rushes up the ice is going to be a balancing act for him, but I think it is going to need to be a thing that develops and comes a ways if he's going to be as effective at 5-on-5 as he could be. And I felt that this issue was a big driver of why his pass percentage just barely crossed 50% in my sample, which is pretty low for a CHL top-end forward. Just to highlight what I'm talking about, in this clip, I would really love to see Matthew Savoie drop down lower to the ice, drop a shoulder, get into more dangerous space, and really be assertive with the puck. But he turns it into a bit of a complex slip pass that just turns into a defensive exit that's a little too easy for his opponent, and the puck's coming back the other way. So Savoie is a player who admittedly is marked by really high talent and really high potential, but he really left me wanting more than I was getting in almost every game that I tracked. But when he was on, he was really good. He does have high-end agility and skill for sure, but he doesn't have that high-end speed that pushes defenders on their heels, and it really seemed to limit his ability to push pucks up the ice himself and push pucks into dangerous space himself in the offensive zone consistently. So the best part of Matthew Savoie's game is just his offensive game. It is a dual-threat offensive style of play in the offensive zone that came out more and more as the year went on. The data took a weird turn around the middle of the year, but to me that's not a bad thing. To me it indicates that this is a player that can do it all. Sometimes he might be able to be put in a more of a scorer's position, finding space in the offensive zone, or he might be a puck possession player along the perimeter, making plays inside, getting below the goal line, making plays down there. There's just a very diverse offensive toolkit that if he can put it all together all at once consistently, could make him really electrifying. And I would love to see Savoie build on that skill level and that agility to be able to make plays like the one I'm highlighting here even more threatening. But he is clearly on the right track, and as he is now, he's still got really good results in the offensive zone. It's just a matter of wanting to see more. But at the end of the day, Savoie scored a lot this season, and that comes from somewhere. He's a really talented player in the offensive zone, and while a lot of that production came on the power play, it at least indicates to me that he is capable of putting pucks in the net. The good part is Savoie's resilience and defensive work rate, which at times go hand in hand. It is hard to fault Matthew Savoie for for at least trying to chip in defensively and be responsible. At times, he could use smooth footwork to cut off rushes in transition, push play to the outside, and this is something I want to see more of, because when I would see him reach out and do weak stick checks in transition, guys would just blow right through it, but if he was calm and fluid and mobile, he did have a little more success closing out those breakouts. But this is also a player where if the puck is on his stick, he does not back down from pressure from opponents. He's often able to chip pucks through line mates through pressure, doesn't give up on plays, and if the escape speed never gets to where it could be, I think there are still signs of Savoie being what I would call a tugboat on skates. Not the biggest player on the ice, but chunky enough and physical enough to make it work and work off of his line mates and get pucks in possession cycles in the offensive zone continuously against higher level competition. It might take some time to figure that out fully, but if the speed doesn't come the way it should, that could be a fallback. Through this work rate, both with and without the puck, he earned a few extra transitions here or there that might have ended up in extended defensive zone cycles or defensive entries. And the more plays I see like the one I'm displaying with Matthew Savoie on defensive breakouts, the better I think he'll end up. And going into my tracking experience on Savoie, I certainly did not think that this would be something that I came away as impressed with as I did. The not so good part are two things. One is his separation speed and the other is his puck management, and there are times where these things intertwine. But it's also kind of hard for me to articulate exactly why I'm a little bit concerned about Matthew Savoie's lack of a separation gear. But at the same time, I just can't help but feel that that lack of a separation gear is why he wasn't as involved in offensive transitions as a lot of other high-end forwards in this year's draft, and why his 5-on-5 production might have been a little limited. And a lot of that could be traced back to being just removed as an option in those transitions in the neutral zone. And I think there's a bit of this good but is it good enough type of hockey that I've seen out of other players that I've previously profiled in this year's draft. And in terms of his puck management, I'm just going to highlight a clip here where Matthew Savoie clearly has a passing option available in Connor McLennan, number 94 in black, but instead of making a read and trying to make the rush himself or pass it to the streaking McLennan up the middle of the ice, he dumps it for an icing. And this is something I think I saw a little more often than I would like with Savoie, especially considering the agility and skill that he possesses. So all in all, Matthew Savoie is a really hard player for me to analyze. I get the feeling that as he is right now, the agility, the resilience, the skill level, and the offensive zone play he brings now could at least make him a productive player in the NHL, and with his unexpected defensive involvement, I think he could drive some decent possession numbers in the NHL as well. But the big question is how big of an actual play driver will he be on his own against bigger and stronger competition? To me, he'll need to add another level of speed to his game, he'll need to add a level of deception that I didn't really see in transition with the puck on his stick, and see an improvement in his ability to remain calm with the puck on his stick, reading options on the ice, and executing on those reads a little bit better, especially in transition, than he did in my data. And this is another weird quirk about Matthew Savoie from the video production side of this report. I only pulled 49 clips across 7 games of Matthew Savoie this season, both good and bad. And usually high-end players that I profile end up closer to 70 or even 80 clips. Marco Rossi crossed 100. And that to me is a little bit of a different kind of indicator here of what's going on with Matthew Savoie. There wasn't a whole lot of bad stuff that I was running out and clipping to put in this video, but there wasn't a whole lot of good stuff I was pulling either. But through it all, Matthew Savoie had an offensive threat metric that approached 30, which is a pretty good benchmark. He showed good defensive involvement. So if the argument I've used with some players in the past of there's downside, but the data is still good, so what happens when things improve, that still holds with a player like Matthew Savoie. So it's just to me a matter of seeing Matthew Savoie at his best more, because when he was really good, but it just wasn't there all that much. The tools are in the toolbox, and I think there's more to be unlocked with better speed generation for sure, because I have seen him waste the space he's in by making low percentage plays from the perimeter, and there were a lot of instances where I just saw him struggle to be a principal conduit through which the puck flowed in the offensive direction. But the mind for offense and the talent with Savoie is absolutely there. He loves to make plays from the greasy areas of the offensive zone down below the goal line, as well as in full flight on the rush. And as an offensive contributor, his potential is sky high, even if he ends up being a player that needs to be surrounded with really good transition talent and he's allowed to focus more in the offensive zone. His one-touch passing in the offensive zone is really, really hard to ignore, and that is projectable to the National Hockey League where time and space are really, really limited. And the final question that I'm always asking myself about this player is, where is he going to be drafted? And honestly, your guess is probably as good as mine. But I get the feeling that NHL scouts are seeing similar issues to what I and others are seeing with Savoie as a truly high-end NHL prospect, which changes the real spectrum with which you analyze these players. There is potential here, but the bar for success in the NHL for players like Savoie, especially at 5-on-5, is really, really, really high. So your bar for evaluation also probably should be really, really high because you do not want to miss on a top 10 pick, especially if you're a rebuilding team. But the big question to me is, can he get there? Is it possible for him to achieve that level? And I honestly believe that the answer there is yes, it's possible. Can he become an extraordinarily exciting, dynamic, offensive creator up the middle or on the wing, wherever he settles? Absolutely. I think there's a long way to go, but with a strong defensive work rate and involvement, I think there could be signs for at least a competent defensive player while blossoming more and more into a better and more confident offensive player in the NHL. There's some risk here. I think there's a wide range of picks where he could go, but I will be very, very interested to see what happens with Matthew Savoie in his upcoming hockey career. So that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, you could subscribe below and click all the buttons so you never miss another one. If you really liked it, you could click join to join the YouTube membership program or subscribe on Patreon, where you'll get access to data visualizations, exclusive player cards, track data across hundreds of draft eligible prospects this season, data sheets for hundreds of drafted and undrafted prospects, as well as plenty of other goodies. Or you can pick up some merchandise from the Scouchwear shop, where 50% of profits go to the Women's Sports Foundation. So that's all, and we'll see you in the next one.